We're going to talk about all of Connecticut with Frank Burns, Executive Director of the Connecticut Tourism Coalition, and Stephen Tagliatella, who is president of this organization. All right, we all want to help the state of Connecticut. We want to keep people here. We want them to comfort tourism, that whole 9 yards. Who started the Connecticut Tourism Coalition?
Well, it's a little bit of a story, and it actually started as Frank was my temporary GM at the Saybrook Point Inn for about 11 months,
okay.
Our family business. And actually my father hired him when we first opened 30 years ago to be a consultant. We never were in the lodging business before, really, as a family. My grandfather was long ago when he had the Castle Inn in Old Saybrook, but that was before my time. And so there was a little bit of a gap because we're in the New Haven area with our family business, which is mostly real estate centric. So we built Saybrook Point Inn, but we didn't know how to operate it. So Frank helped us get our opening team together. And that was 30 years ago, and we've remained friends and stayed in touch over the years. And then when I needed a general manager, because I was in between GMs, he stepped up and became my GM for about 14 months.
14 months.
So you know a lot about the Tagliatella family and could write a book.
Yep.
Yes. So who formed the coalition, and what is it for?
Actually, it was a kind of a joint venture that Steve and I had talked about. Again, in traveling back and forth and listening to radio coming down here, I kept hearing things that weren't very positive, and I kept saying to Stephen, you know what, I think these guys in Hartford are going to put us out of business. All right, and we need to do something to help the tourism industry because it looks as though we're suffering compared to what the other states around us are doing. And I like to tell a story of what happened in New York. And
I can hear the accent.
Yeah, you can hear the accent.
It's official.
Yeah.
In 1979, the I Love New York program came into play, and probably by everybody's estimation, the most successful state promotional campaign of the times. And it was funded to the tune of $19 million. Fast forward, Mario Cuomo comes to power. The state's got some budgetary woes. They cut the budget back to $6.5 billion. So at that point in time, the Restaurant Association and the Lodging Association got together and they formed the New York State Tourism Coalition with the intent of petitioning the governor and the legislative leaders to restore the funding to I Love New York. So they were able to get the parks and the attractions, and they were able, more importantly, get the chambers and the convention bureaus to come on board. They formed a coalition, they had a board, and they had an advocacy day which would take place in March each year, where they would go to Albany and they would petition the governor and the legislature to restore the funding. And over the course of time, they were gradually able to get the funding restored. Fast forward, 9/11 comes. And that was really the kind of the wake-up call in New York. The day before, you know, Times Square occupancy is in hotels is running about 92%, and the rate's pretty good, and the restaurants are full, and the theater's full. And 3 days later, afterwards, there's Governor Pataki and Mayor Giuliani and Robert De Niro standing in Times Square, and there's nobody there.
Yeah.
And so that was, then the legislature found $40 million to, again, promote New York City. You might remember the ads back then, the governor and the mayor and celebrities telling people it was safe to come back, the restaurants were open, the theater was open, and that was really the beginning of pushing things or tourism funding back to where it needed to be.
So we copied it here in the state of Connecticut? This was the template
well, he
for
made his mistakes in New York, and now he's bringing his expertise to Connecticut.
Right, so when did we form the coalition in this state?
3 years ago.
3 years ago.
Yeah, just 3 years ago.
Yeah.
And is New York the template for this coalition?
Yeah, we looked at a couple of other states and what they were doing, but New York seemed to fit kind of what we wanted to do here. And so I said to Stephen, maybe we should try to replicate something like this. And we did some research. We talked to some legislators to see what they thought this was viable. We kind of reached out to some of the other tourism attractions to see if this would be something that they would be willing to support.
So was it embraced immediately in the state of Connecticut?
Yes.
Yes, indeed it was.
You know, 2 years ago, Memorial Day weekend, we had 2 members. It was Stephen and Kevin Dodd from the Valley Railroad. And here we are today, 2 years later, we have 160 members. And we represent
statewide?
Statewide. We represent the 5 congressional districts. And we probably have 9 of the top 10 attractions in Connecticut that are part of the coalition. But we wanted to, in our message to the governor and to the legislature, indicate it's just not the big guys, but we're also interested in the small, local businesses, because again, as a tourist, if you're coming to Saybrook, you need to go to the hardware store. Right?
Sure.
You need to go to the florist store. You need to go to the cheese store. So we have not only the small local businesses, but we all have banks and financial institutions and insurance companies, because again, in construction trades, because they build them, they finance them, they insure them, and again, we wanted to send the message that that this is really a diverse industry that we represent, and it impacts everybody in some capacity.
So what have you been able to do in the 3 years since you formed?
Well, we spent a lot of time building membership, and so we've gotten it to a critical mass, and within that membership we have 30 board members. And in addition to that, now we wanted to get out and speak to the legislature, leadership, the governor.
You have a new governor now.
We have a new governor. And so he has his transition team, and I'm going to be on one of those transition teams for tourism, which I'm very excited about. And so that's just forming now. And
what are you going to tell the new governor?
That to spend money on marketing. You need to market the state of Connecticut. As Frank was about to say, New York is now spending $69.5 million. And then we have Massachusetts. Governor Baker spends $11 million on tourism marketing. And Gina McCarthy, which is on our eastern front of Rhode Island, she spends now $5.5 million. And the reason why they spend this money is not because they have extra money to spend. In many cases, they have deficits just like we do, but there's a very, very direct return on investment in tax dollars to the state of Connecticut. So if you had your purse with you and you had $1, I would take that $1, and before the fiscal year was over, I'd give you $3 back. And that's
Promise.
Promise. And there's very good research that proves that. So this is a money-making proposition for the state. And so why wouldn't you spend $25 million and get $75 million back and a $50 million profit?
You know, the old joke is you drive through Connecticut to get to Boston, and you drive through Connecticut to get to New York. Right. So the coalition, how do we keep people here? What's your elevator speech? What are you going to do moving forward?
We have, during the election cycle, we met with all of the gubernatorial candidates and to try to educate them, because what we discovered, they really didn't know much about tourism. And we had 4 points that our members and our board had kind of signed off on that we wanted to relay to them. The first thing was that we needed a sustainable source of funding to market and promote tourism. Back when they raised
So you will do the marketing for the state? I mean, you guys will, or it'll be in...
That's part two.
Gotcha, okay.
So the first thing we look for, we need money in order to market. And so we've asked the candidates to support our position in taking 3% of the taxable lodging revenue in Connecticut to fund tourism, which would be about $22 million this year. The second point is that there's currently an advisory committee that works with state tourism, but they don't have an awful lot of say into what happens. So we'd like to reinvent that advisory committee with people from the industry that actually have some input and would have some say as to how and where the monies were spent. The third point, and at one point in time, tourism was a direct report to the governor's office. It currently goes through economic development, and we'd like to see that. And that was something that one of the candidates actually raised with us, saying if I'm elected governor, then I'll restore that. And then the last thing that we all have a problem with, and to your point, people driving from New York and Boston, is that the visitor centers
closed.
Closed? The one in Westbrook. I opened that decades ago when I was a young reporter here.
And you know, it's really kind of a disgrace, because state economic development will tell you that the last year that they were open, that they had 1 million+ visitors that stopped by there. You know, and me in the business world, if I turn away 1 million customers, I'd be out of a job.
You know, you brought up the I Love New York campaign. Everybody in the tri-state area knows it. It was in my opinion, a brilliant campaign. Yep. How do we build an I Love Connecticut campaign in this state that resonates like that one did?
Well, we're kind of hoping that will take place with the new administration coming in, and the revolutionary campaign that we saw with the Malloy administration.
Do you think that worked? Still revolutionary?
I don't think anybody understood what it was. Again, that's just me speaking.
And there was a song, and we haven't heard the song a lot. And I think they spent $27 million on it.
One of the things that we heard when we go up to visit legislative leaders is, one of them in particular is how much longer are we going to have the revolutionary campaign? And I mean, I think it was probably fine at the time. It kind of lived its useful life, but it didn't have the wherewithal or the staying power that I Love New York had. And just as a sideline, I Love New York, the brand will stay, but the message is now changing. And the message now will be is New York has it all.
Okay, so there are neighbors.
Yep.
Will you go to the new governor, being on his transition team for tourism, and help him craft a byline, a tagline for the state of Connecticut that
we would welcome
works?
the opportunity to have input.
Yep.
And so DECD is the place where this probably all takes place, and they're the ones that make up the budget, or they make up the marketing plan, but they only can do what they get given. So if they have a marketing plan with $1, that's what they work with. And unfortunately, that has happened in the state of Connecticut. We used to have a $1 line item, and the rest of the country used to look at Connecticut as an example on what not to do. We had #1 state in summer tourism in 1992 was Colorado. So they cut their marketing budget, and in 2 years they dropped 17 places. So it happens very quickly. So the reverse happens as quickly as the 3-to-1 that we just talked about, and within the same fiscal year. So they dropped 17 places in 2 years.
If I'm not mistaken, the Still Revolutionary campaign did not have a lot of marketers from the state. They hired it from out of the state. You would advocate getting marketing companies from in-state.
Yeah, what's wrong with the people that work in Connecticut?
Correct.
And employ them. We have very fine marketers in the state of Connecticut. We don't need to go outside our borders for that. No.
I think a lot of people were surprised by that.
We all agree that the state has some financial woes, excuse me, but we think that promoting tourism and the fact that you invest one, you get 3 back in the same fiscal year is really kind of a no-brainer. All right, and it's one of the few things that there's enough statistics out there to prove that this will work. It's not going to solve the budget deficit, but it's a piece of the pie that does a couple of things. One, it helps the state with revenues, it creates jobs, and it improves the quality of life of people here in Connecticut. Because again, as you mentioned earlier, we got people that are leaving and we want them to do what? We want them to stay.
What do you want the general public to know about Connecticut Tourism Coalition? What do you want people, do you need their help? Does that need to be a household name, or are you going to be a branch?
We're kind of under the radar, and what we're really trying to do is get the legislature and the leadership to back a sustainable marketing plan so that we can market to the state, to in-state residents and out-of-state residents. Our occupancy tax is 15% in the state of Connecticut. It's the highest occupancy tax in the nation. And when Frank said we want 3 percentage points of that, that's a very small portion of the occupancy tax. It generates $120+ million a year, and some of that money needs to be directed into the arts and into tourism.
Are you gathering members as we speak, and is this just to show a critical mass of people in the state to say, hey, do something?
I think part of the message from Governor Malloy at one point in time, and he mentioned it to Stephen, was the fact that we as an industry have been pretty splintered. All right, and historically we've gone to the governor's office and legislators, and we've had our little pet peeves that we've wanted them to sponsor or support. This is an attempt by the industry to come together and have a united front and say, for us, in order to survive, our business to survive, for us to keep our employees employed, all right, and put food on their table and put a roof over their head and clothing and send their kids to school, we need to invest. And that investment is finding a sustainable source of funding to market and promote tourism in the state of Connecticut. All right? And they had it in a lockbox the first year, all right, and the legislature figured out what a lockbox was, and it disappeared. They used the term dedicated fund, but they figured out what that was, and that kind of went away. This needs to be something that's going to be there that the legislature can't get their hands on to take those monies and use other things. This works. This is proven.
1 to 3.
1 to 3.
Or more.
It's actually more than that,
more.
but everybody in Hartford seems to be comfortable with 1 to 3, so we don't push. Other states are higher. New York's probably $4.50, Vermont $6. The arts people will tell you they get from $7 to $14 back, depending upon their location and their venue.
It's November 2018. What do you hope to do in 2019 under a new, perhaps partnership with new administration in the state of Connecticut? What are next steps?
Our next step would be to have a dedicated source of funding. and to have it at a level that makes sense for the state of Connecticut. And so we've looked at research, and there's a bell curve on how much is the most cost-effective dollar for the state of Connecticut, and it's about $27 million. And so that would be the ideal, and then you would have the most efficient possible marketing campaign to bring people into the state of Connecticut. Our goal, you asked what our goal is to create traffic jams on exit ramps in the state of Connecticut.
I see fierce eyes right there. Well, we love this state. It's even though you're in New York, but you're in Connecticut a lot.
I spent a lot of time in Connecticut. It's a great place.
Connecticate has so much.
So I have to tell you a funny story.
But it's a secret.
Yeah.
Frank's gotten some awards for his work in New York, and one of the recent awards that he got was Tourism of the Year, Person of the Year, and it was the year that he worked for me for the 14 months.
See, there you go. So you make a good partnership. Yep. I'm expecting huge things from you guys in 2019.
Thank you.
And hopefully there are billboards, and there's maybe a jingle, and maybe there's a tagline.
Yeah, we need to reinvent ourselves.
Like I Love New York, which nobody's going to forget.
Yeah.
Gentlemen,
and when people vacation here and they like it, they become residents here. I have my next door neighbors on both sides of me that were New York State residents. They vacationed here, they liked it so much, they retired into our area, which is really wonderful. We need more taxpayers in the state of Connecticut. We don't need more taxes.
It's a beautiful state.
Yeah, we just need to educate the new governor, and we need to educate the legislators that this is an investment. This is a business decision, not a political decision. And this is going to help with the survival of the state going forward.
Well, thank you so much for being here, Frank Burns and Stephen Tagliatella.
Always a pleasure.
Good luck and go for it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Who's this girl? Spend all night kissing, and if was right here, then who else is missing? Got a little sidetracked, if I'm so wishing I could find the keys to the door, but it's also